First of all, it's a surreal experience.
He killed her.
Experiencing the aftermath of loss and public scrutiny is surreal. To say he killed her carries a weight that is almost unbearable in its starkness. For years, Blake Fielder-Civil, once inseparable from the legendary Amy Winehouse, has maintained silence. Branded as the antagonist in a contemporary tragedy, he has been vilified publicly. Many have accused him of introducing Amy to heroin, holding him responsible for the demise of the woman whose talent defined a generation. Tonight, we revisit one of the most heartbreaking losses in modern music. Amy Winehouse, found lifeless in her London home at the age of 27. Blake faded from the spotlight as Amy's fame ascended, her voice immortalized in cultural memory. Now, more than a decade later, he steps forward, not to defend, but to unravel the complex story behind her death. I blamed myself for years, he admits, and I still do in many ways. Yet he is candid in acknowledging that Amy's death was not the product of a single mistake. It was the consequence of a myriad of factors, culminating in alcohol overconsumption, as confirmed by the coroner's inquest in July. It wasn't just me, he insists. It was all of us. His voice wavers, emotions palpable, as he recalls the roles played by her father, the tabloids, intrusive paparazzi, and self-proclaimed fans who cheered her decline. They killed her. I killed her. We all killed her, he declares. This is not a story of redemption, nor a tidy narrative of forgiveness. It is a reckoning. Blake Fielder-Civil speaks for the first time about a love that was both intoxicating and destructive, and a world that watched its unraveling with morbid fascination. Amy and Blake's story, outwardly toxic and sensationalized by media, was, for them, deeply complicated. A connection forged not in the superficiality of romance, but in shared pain, misfortune, and a longing for understanding that neither could find elsewhere. They met in 2005, in a gritty Camden pub pulsating with raw energy, reflective of their own rebellious spirits. This encounter did not ignite immediate romantic sparks. It was a collision of obsessions. Blake recalls Amy as loud, fearless, sharp, and infinitely sad, her eyes revealing the depth of her private anguish. It is in this mutual recognition of brokenness that they found each other, like two fractured mirrors reflecting a world they both struggled to navigate alone. Amy, an emerging star whose voice could pierce the soul, in Blake, a restless wanderer marked by a tumultuous past, connected over shared humor, late nights, music, and the ache of feeling perpetually misunderstood. Both carried the scars of fractured families and accelerated childhoods, finding solace in chaos. We didn't fall in love like most people, Blake confesses. It was more like we crashed into each other, and neither of us ever truly walked away from a wreck. To Amy, Blake was more than a companion. He was her muse. The songs she wrote, including Back to Black and You Know I'm No Good, were diary entries immortalized in music, an unfiltered reflection of the intensity, anguish, and volatility of their relationship. Critics deemed it toxic. Amy considered it authentic. Beneath this fervent passion, however, was an intricate codependency, a bond strengthened not solely by love, but by shared suffering. And when the weight of that suffering became unbearable, they sought solace in ever more dangerous ways. The roots of Blake Fielder-Civil and Amy Winehouse's story stretch far beyond the public eye, deep into the fragmented worlds of their early childhoods. Before the cameras, before the music, and long before the world labeled them, they were two children learning to navigate instability, loss, and emotional neglect. Their formative years were marked by fractured homes and absent figures, shaping the emotional landscapes that would later dictate their choices and vulnerabilities. Blake grew up in Lincolnshire, in quiet towns that outwardly seemed serene, yet his household was anything but peaceful. Divorce entered his life at an early age, leaving emotional fissures that were not visible to the casual observer, but that profoundly influenced him. His father became a distant presence, physically there on occasion, but emotionally absent, a shadow that failed to provide guidance or stability. Blake's mother did her best, but even her love could not shield him from the pervasive sense of neglect and confusion that accompanied it. I didn't know what stability looked like, Blake later admitted. I thought chaos was normal. As he grew, Blake sought escape from the turbulent world around him. He began skipping school, dabbling in petty crime, and experimenting with drugs. It was less about rebellion than survival, a way to numb the pain and disconnection he felt daily. No one taught him how to cope or how to channel his emotions in constructive ways. He existed in a liminal space, suspended between longing for connection and the urge to disappear entirely. Amy Winehouse's childhood, though different in setting, mirrored many of Blake's emotional challenges. Raised in Southgate, North London, she was a daughter of Mitch and Janice Winehouse, loving parents who eventually separated when she was 9. The departure of her father left a wound she would carry throughout her life, a persistent ache of loss and longing for stability. Blake remembers Amy as tough yet fragile, a paradox of strength and vulnerability. She could wield words like weapons, sharp and unyielding, yet at her core, she craved love that would not falter or abandon her. From an early age, Amy gravitated toward music, jazz, soul, and the voices of women who transformed personal pain into artistry captivated her. Her voice was a gift, but it was accompanied by volatility. Her rebellion was not simply a challenge to authority. It was a cry for control in a life that seemed to slip away from her constantly. Amy's talent was undeniable, yet her brilliance existed alongside profound emotional fragility, a duality that would later define her public image. When Blake and Amy met in 2005, they found in each other an unspoken recognition of shared trauma. Their connection was not typical romantic love. It was something deeper, primal, a recognition of mirrored pain. Neither had to explain their struggles. They were self-evident, written into their mannerisms, their expressions, their very presence. She knew my damage because it looked like hers, Blake reflected. Both carried the scars of fractured families, absent fathers, and emotional neglect, forging a bond forged not in safety, but in understanding and familiarity. Blake and Amy's early encounters were charged with intensity. Unlike conventional relationships, theirs was a collision of personalities, of past pains and unmet needs. Sparks did not merely flicker, they exploded. They bonded over sarcasm, ska music, late-night adventures, and a shared sense of misfit existence. Their connection was addictive, intoxicating, and ultimately unsustainable. For Amy, Blake was more than a partner. He was a muse, an emotional catalyst who inspired some of her most iconic work. For Blake, Amy represented both the brilliance and the danger of deep emotional intimacy. Yet, beneath the passionate exterior, their relationship was rooted in instability. Shared childhood trauma had taught them to seek intensity as a measure of connection. They mistook recognition for love, passion for security, chaos for comfort. We saw the same damage in each other and thought, this must be it. This must be what love feels like. Blake admits, in their early days together, their interactions were a dance of extremes. Laughter interwoven with despair, connection shadowed by fear. Each understood the other in ways no one else could, yet this intimacy carried its own danger. The very traits that drew them together, brokenness, longing, intensity, also planted the seeds of their eventual downfall. Amy and Blake did not merely fall into love. They collided, consumed, and co-created a world in which the boundaries between affection and toxicity blurred. Even before substance use escalated, the emotional landscape they inhabited was perilous. Both had grown up believing love could be conditional, unstable, or absent entirely. The sense of belonging they sought was elusive, and their codependency became a way of navigating that void. Their early struggles foreshadowed the challenges that would follow, demonstrating how unresolved childhood trauma can reverberate throughout adult life, shaping choices, relationships, and ultimately destiny. By understanding their childhoods, we can see the complexity of the bond between Amy and Blake. It was a collision of shared histories, mirrored pain, and a longing for connection that neither had previously experienced. They were drawn together not just by attraction, but by a deep recognition of each other's fractured selves. This recognition, though beautiful, carried consequences they could not foresee, a foreshadowing of the tragedy that would later unfold in their lives. The year 2005 marked the beginning of a connection that would ignite both brilliance and devastation. When Amy Winehouse and Blake Fielder-Civil met, it was not love at first sight in conventional sense. It was something far more intense, raw, and urgent, a collision of two damaged souls recognizing themselves in a reflection of the other. The environment of Camden, with its chaotic pubs and underground energy, mirrored their internal states, providing a backdrop for a relationship fueled by obsession passion, and mutual understanding of pain. Blake recalls the moment vividly. Amy was unlike anyone he had ever met. Fearless, brash, yet undeniably sad. Her eyes betrayed a depth of sorrow that Blake immediately recognized. "I think she saw the same in me," he says, reflecting on the sense of recognition that drew them together. Two broken individuals, shaped by fractured families and turbulent childhoods, found solace in each other's presence. They did not need to explain themselves. They were instantly understood. From the outset, their bond was electric but volatile. Unlike ordinary relationships, where attraction is gradual and affection develops over time, Amy and Blake's connection was explosive. Sparks did not merely fly. They ignited into flames, a passion that was as consuming as it was dangerous. Their similarities were stark. Both had experienced emotional neglect, both craved intensity, and both found comfort in chaos. In many ways, they were each other's mirror, reflecting the damage they could not otherwise escape. This intense connection, however, soon became intertwined with a darker element: substance use. Blake had been using heroin long before Amy entered his life, seeing it not as rebellion, but as a form of escape from a childhood haunted by instability and pain. Heroin, for him, was a numbing agent, a way to silence the incessant turmoil that followed him since his youth. He never glorified the drug. It was not a symbol of defiance, but a method of survival, a private way to cope with trauma that otherwise seemed unmanageable. Amy, though aware of Blake's habits, was initially resistant. She had witnessed his struggles, the toll that heroin took on his body and mind, and pleaded with him to stop. Their fights over his addiction were frequent, often ending in tears, arguments, and moments of fragile reconciliation. But one pivotal night marked a turning point in their relationship and set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of both their lives. In a dimly lit flat in East London, Amy sat beside Blake, the room silent except for the weight of unspoken words and a heroin needle between them. Blake remembers the moment with haunting clarity. "I'll never forget it," he whispers. "I wish I could. God, I wish I could." That night, Amy asked Blake if she could try the drug. Her reasoning was not rooted in defiance, but in a desire for intimacy, a wish to understand Blake completely. "I just want to feel what you feel. I want to know you completely," she told him. Blake refused. He did not hand her the needle, not out of cruelty, but because he recognized the danger and the irreversible consequences that would follow. Yet, despite his resistance, the very presence of temptation and exposure to his world began to pull Amy into a reality she could not easily escape. It was a subtle, insidious step, a crack in the armor that would eventually widen. That night, Blake realized everything had changed. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. Heroin became a shared ritual, a form of twisted intimacy that both numbed and bonded them. For Amy, the drug offered attachment, from pain, from pressure, from the intensity of her own life. For Blake, it was already a familiar escape, a way to silence inner chaos. Together, they developed a codependency that was as intoxicating as it was destructive. They were not merely lovers. They were enmeshed in a cycle of mutual reinforcement, each enabling the other's self-destructive tendencies. The effects of their choices were immediate and devastating. Amy's creativity, once boundless and unrestrained, began to show cracks. Laughter faded, music slipped, and the vibrancy that had defined her personality dimmed. Blake, too, was ensnared, unable to extricate himself from a spiral that had started long before their meeting. "I used to hold her while she was coming down," he recalls. "She'd cry, saying she wanted to quit, and then we'd do it again the next night. I felt like I was killing her one night at a time." The guilt Blake carried was monumental. Amy had entered his world willingly, out of love, out of a desire to share his experiences. Yet the outcome was catastrophic. The intensity of their relationship, combined with addiction, became a crucible of emotional and physical pain. Every attempt to connect, to love, to protect, seemed to exacerbate the damage. Their codependency was a paradox. The very bond that gave them a sense of belonging was the same force driving them toward ruin. Outside observers, including the media, fans, and even those closest to Amy, failed to grasp the complexity of the situation. To the world, it was a simple narrative, the talented singer corrupted by a reckless partner. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. Amy's vulnerability, Blake's trauma, and the societal pressures surrounding fame all converged to create a perfect storm. It was a tragedy not only of personal choices, but of environment, circumstance, and neglect. Even in those early months, the patterns of their eventual downfall were visible. Arguments that might have been private became fodder for public consumption, and moments of intimacy were shadowed by impending catastrophe. The world was beginning to notice, but no one truly understood. Blake and Amy were navigating a perilous terrain alone, their only guide a reflection of their shared pain in each other. Their descent was gradual, yet relentless. It was marked not by sudden catastrophe, but by incremental erosion, small compromises. By the late 2000s, the storm that had been brewing in Amy Winehouse and Blake Fieldercivil's lives reached a critical point. Their relationship, already defined by intensity, codependency, and shared trauma, became further entangled with the destructive pull of heroin. What had started as a moment of curiosity, a shared experiment with drugs, evolved into a cycle that consumed both of them physically, emotionally, and socially. Heroin was no longer simply an escape. It became the axis around which their lives revolved. For Amy, who had always struggled with the weight of expectation, fame, and unresolved personal pain, the drug offered a perverse sanctuary. It allowed her to detach from pressures that were otherwise unbearable. Pressures from the media, from her fans, from her family, and even from herself. For Blake, it was already a familiar companion, a way to numb the ongoing turmoil of his own unresolved trauma. Together, they formed a symbiotic system, each feeding off the other's pain and seeking solace in the temporary oblivion heroin provided. Blake recalls the early stages of Amy's descent into drug use with a mixture of guilt, shame, and sorrow. That night changed everything, he says, his voice tight with emotion. I opened a door for her that she didn't need to walk through, and I couldn't stop what followed. Heroin was seductive not just in its chemical effect, but in the intimacy it created. To both of them, the drug was more than a substance. It was a shared ritual, a language of connection that replaced healthier forms of intimacy. As the months passed, the effects of addiction became increasingly visible. Amy's radiant energy, the force that had captivated millions, began to fade. Her performances were inconsistent, her appearances unpredictable, and her physical health visibly deteriorated. Audiences and fans witnessed only fragments of this decline. A slurred performance here, a canceled show there, a photograph capturing a moment of vulnerability. But the full scope of her struggle remained private, known only to those closest to her. And tragically, to the world at large, these glimpses were reduced to scandal and gossip. Blake, for his part, was also struggling. He had entered a relationship with his own unresolved traumas, and now he was engulfed in a downward spiral that he could neither control nor escape. The emotional pressure watching Amy suffer, coupled with his own dependency, created a feedback loop that intensified both of their addictions. I felt like I was killing her one night at a time, he admits. Amy Winehouse's life was a dazzling mix of talent, vulnerability, and tragedy. Her relationship with Blake Fieldercivil, though intensely passionate, was intertwined with addiction, codependency, and chaos. For years, Blake bore the weight of guilt alone, blaming himself for what happened, while the world watched and judged without understanding the full picture. Now he speaks openly, not to excuse his actions, but to acknowledge them honestly. I didn't kill Amy, he admits, but I didn't save her either. Her death was not caused by one person alone. It was a product of many forces: love and failure, fame and isolation, societal voyeurism, and systemic neglect. Amy's music immortalizes her pain, her brilliance, and her humanity. Behind the legend, she was a real person, messy, insecure, fiercely talented, and deeply human. Her story reminds us that fame cannot protect against suffering, and silence or indifference can have devastating consequences. Blake's reckoning is also a mirror to society. It calls for compassion, awareness, and responsibility, not just for public figures, but for all who struggle unseen. Amy may be gone, but through her songs and the lessons of her life, she continues to speak, urging the world to listen, care, and remember the human behind the fame.